In this video, I'm going to give you a quick guide to how to get into Nietzsche. What book should you start with and how should you read him? So I've been teaching Nietzsche in various different European universities for over 10 years. I published a book on Nietzsche with Cambridge University Press, and I've also co-edited a volume of essays on Nietzsche with Bloomsbury. So throughout the whole time that I've been working on Nietzsche, students keep asking me the same question. What book should they read if they want to get into Nietzsche? And so I've created this video to give people some tips and to basically make it a bit easier for you to start out with this wonderful philosopher. The first thing I'd like to say is that reading Nietzsche can be a transformative experience. He can really alter our lives and very much for the better. So I'm delighted that you've set out on the path towards reading Nietzsche and that you want to immerse yourselves more fully in his philosophy. This is wonderful news. However, I think that if we're going to really unlock the hidden value of Nietzsche's thoughts, it's important that we observe some general advice. Although I like to remain positive and affirmative, I think that when people are getting into Nietzsche, it's important to bear in mind a few cautionary words, a few don'ts in short. So the first of these don'ts is don't read Zarathustra as the first book you pick up by Nietzsche. Now, lots of people are tempted to read this book because it's one of Nietzsche's most famous books. And so people go to it, but they tend to find that it is incredibly cryptic, they don't understand it, and there is a tendency to then see Nietzsche as a very unclear or vague thinker. Because the work is a work of poetry, and one really needs to understand the rest of his philosophy, which is often much clearer and argumentative, in order to really be able to unpack what he's saying in Zarathustra. So my first recommendation would be to leave Zarathustra till last. Make sure you're familiar with his thought more generally before you dive into this incredibly difficult, complex, and veiled work. My second piece of cautionary advice is don't start out with The Will to Power. Now, this is arguably Nietzsche's second most famous book. However, the problem with it is that it is a collection of his posthumous notes. So these are notebook entries that he wrote while he was traveling and working. However, they were edited by his sister, along with one of his friends as well. However, his sister was a card-carrying Nazi. And so what she did was she edited his works. She edited and selected these notes in order to make him out to be more of a proto-fascist than he in fact was. So the work is really not truly a work by Nietzsche. Reading his notes is a fantastic experience, and I recommend everybody to get into his notebooks, but you can certainly find better editions, for example, published by Cambridge or by Stanford University Press. My third piece of advice would be don't begin with The Birth of Tragedy. Now, this was Nietzsche's first published book, and it is a terrific Nietzschean text. However, it's really an immature Nietzschean text in the sense that he's very much enthralled to Schopenhauer and Wagner. And these figures really structure many of his thoughts in that book. And he wholeheartedly rejects both of these figures in his later writings. So we don't really get a representative image of Nietzsche. And I think that it can really give people the wrong impression of what he's all about. So I would say maybe this would be a great third or fourth book to read, but certainly not the first book. So now that I've laid out those three don'ts, those cautionary words, we can move on to my more positive recommendations. So if I was going to recommend one single book by Nietzsche to you, especially to start with, it would be this book, The Gay Science. Now, the reason that I would recommend this book to you is that it is a book that contains so much wonderful life affirmation. He is really telling us how to be joyful. It is the gay science. It's the science of being joyful. He tells us how to regulate our diet, how to organize our impulses, how to interrogate our conscience, and really found an ethics, a way of behaving and thinking that is going to lead to our own authentic self-realization. So he tries to break us out of our conformism and help us find ourselves and what's going to be good for us. So I think that this is a fantastic book for cultivating oneself and for opening one's eyes to the reality of the self and the world. Another great fact about this book is that although it was written in 1882, so it's really a middle period book by Nietzsche, he added another part at the end of the book 5 years later in 1887. So this creates a very strange and disjointed book, However, I think this is really excellent for first-time readers because it gives you a sense of how his whole philosophy, how his mature philosophy really hangs together. What's more, he wrote the book in one of the most beautiful landscapes in Sils Maria in Switzerland, and the majestic landscape really emanates from the writings themselves. And so we really feel this joyful energy of the hiker bounding through the mountains. And yeah, this is another real strong selling point for the book. The second book that I tend to recommend, if people are more interested in political philosophy and perhaps are a little bit more familiar with Nietzsche, is this book called Beyond Good and Evil. Now, the reason that I recommend this book sometimes is that I think that it's the most representative book by Nietzsche. I think it is the book that really captures his philosophy. Although The Gay Science is certainly a mature work by Nietzsche, it's still a middle period work. So there are many ideas contained in that book that he abandons as he continues through his philosophical development. Beyond Good and Evil, on the other hand, is really the book that I take to be quintessentially the mature Nietzsche. It is where we find his ideas crystallizing, and he really finds a unique position that in many ways defines his later thought as a whole. But one of the reasons that I don't recommend this book, unless I've asked people a few questions first, is that it contains some really concerning and in many ways unpalatable political philosophical reflections. So, for example, he defends slavery, he defends exploitation, he puts forward many vociferously anti-democratic ideas. The unfortunate fact is that many people find these comments too off-putting and just put Nietzsche down. And I think this is a terrible shame, because often when Nietzsche is engaging in this rhetoric, he's not outright supporting aristocracy or authoritarianism. What he's doing is he's simply trying to provoke us to think in a more diverse way about the value of democracy and how we should organize ourselves politically in order to flourish maximally, flourish individually and flourish collectively. So these thoughts need to be seen in the context of a wider conceptual philosophical framework. And I think that one can get this by having a few other Nietzsche books under one's belt before one goes into Beyond Good and Evil. Nonetheless, it's a riveting read, especially for people that are more interested in the political aspects of Nietzsche, because The Gay Science is much more focused on individual ethics and doesn't have quite as great a political relevance as Beyond Good and Evil. So if you're more interested in political questions, then certainly start out with Beyond Good and Evil. However, approach the text with caution and try to be as charitable as you possibly can. Now that you know which books to read, we should move on to talking about how to read those books. I think with Nietzsche, it's important not to just plunge in and to have a little bit of a method when we go into his books. The first reason for this is that Nietzsche often contradicts himself, and people find this very frustrating, especially if they're not familiar with his approach and they're expecting something more rational, more coherent, or logical. However, when Nietzsche contradicts himself, he's often doing so very consciously, and this is because he thought the best way to understand a thing, an object, a phenomenon, or idea is to approach it from as many different contradictory perspectives as possible. And it's only when we've done this that we can rise above those different partial perspectives and decide what the best and most appropriate way of thinking about that thing really is. And he often wants you or I, the reader, to decide for ourselves. He doesn't want to spoon feed us the answers. By presenting us with these conflicting, contradictory statements, often within the same text, he is trying to provoke us to think for ourselves. And so when we come across these contradictory statements, these conflicting claims, we need to be careful not to just write him off as a kind of vague or inconsistent thinker, and to be as charitable and generous to him as possible, to read more and see if we can construct a more complete constellation of views within his texts, and to see if we can actually take those and form our own perspective off the back of Nietzsche's philosophy. And this brings us to the second point that I'd like to raise, and that I think can really enhance people's enjoyment of Nietzsche's texts. And this is that there are some persistent motivations running through all of his texts like a golden thread, and that once we see this golden thread, this can actually help us unify many of his conflicting statements. And this golden thread is basically two things. On the one hand, Nietzsche wants to affirm life. Throughout all of his philosophy, he wants to say yes to life, warts and all. So he wants us to see life. He wants us to throw away all of the superstitions that cloud our view of reality, cloud our view of ourselves and the value of our thoughts, of other people's actions, and so on. He wants us to really see, appreciate, acknowledge, and affirm real life. The second fundamental unifying idea that runs through Nietzsche's works is that of life enhancement. Nietzsche really wants to tell us how we can become better, stronger people, both individually and collectively. This is not simply an egoistic project. This is also one about collective flourishing. How can we individually flourish, and how can we flourish as communities? Sometimes there isn't simply one way of enhancing our flourishing. There are multiple different ways, and they all need to be considered and weighed up against one another. To wrap up then, I would say try to bear these ideas in mind when you're reading his individual texts, because they can often look like a great multitude or cluster of conflicting fragments, but in fact they're a constellation that are all united by a single unifying set of ideas. Most importantly, try to read him generously and charitably. He is trying to help humanity. Many people think that he is an egoist, he's a nihilist, an antichrist. In fact, what he really wants to do is help everyone, help humanity, and to really guide us into the future in as strong and flourishing a fashion as he possibly can. I would also like to add, if you enjoyed this content, please like and subscribe to my channel, because this helps my channel grow and allows me to make more videos like this. And above all, just enjoy reading Nietzsche. It's a wonderful experience. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope to see you soon.